Over the following weeks, Rebecca began reaching out, first with friendly emails, then with requests to meet for coffee, then with thinly veiled suggestions that it would be in my best interest to help her with certain career opportunities. She never explicitly threatened to expose me. She was too smart for that. But the implication was clear. She wanted something from me, and if I didn't provide it, she would make my life very difficult. I should have gone to Marcus. I should have talked to someone, anyone, about what was happening. But I was so deep in my web of lies by then that I couldn't imagine asking for help. Asking for help would mean admitting what I had done, and I still wasn't ready to do that. So, I tried to manage Rebecca myself. I introduced her to contacts who might be useful to her. I recommended her for positions at other firms. I did everything I could to give her what she wanted without directly acknowledging the leverage she held over me. For a while, it seemed to work. She backed off. The threatening undertones faded from her messages. I allowed myself to believe that the crisis had passed. But I had underestimated her. Rebecca wasn't just looking for career advancement, she was looking for revenge. Years later, I would learn the full story. She had been passed over for a promotion at our old firm, a promotion that had gone to someone else partly because of a recommendation I had made. She had never forgotten that slight. And when she discovered that my entire career was built on a lie, she saw an opportunity not just to advance herself, but to destroy me. The unraveling began slowly, so slowly that I didn't even notice it at first. It started with questions from HR at my firm. They said they were updating personnel files and needed to verify some old records. They asked for copies of my degree certificate and transcripts. I stalled. I said I would have to dig through old boxes in the attic. I said the documents might have been lost in a move years ago. They said not to worry. They could request the records directly from the university. That was when I knew it was over. I had 2 weeks, maybe 3, before they would discover that Manchester Metropolitan University had no record of a student named Daniel Harrison graduating in my supposed year. 2 weeks before 17 years of lies would come crashing down around me. 2 weeks before I would lose my career, my reputation, and quite possibly my marriage. I spent those weeks in a state of barely controlled panic. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. I couldn't focus on anything except the countdown to my own destruction. Sarah knew something was seriously wrong. She begged me to tell her what was happening. She said she could see me falling apart and she was scared. She said whatever it was, we could face it together. But I still couldn't tell her. Even with the walls closing in, even with everything I had built about to collapse, I couldn't find the words to confess. The truth had become a physical object in my throat, something solid and immovable that I could not force past my lips, no matter how hard I tried. In the end, I didn't have to tell her. She found out on her own. It was a Saturday afternoon. I had gone into the office, claiming I needed to prepare for a meeting, but really I was trying to figure out if there was any way to salvage the situation. When I came home, Sarah was sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of papers in front of her. Her face was pale, and her hands were trembling, and I knew in that instant that my life as I had known it was finished. She had found a letter from Rebecca. I don't know how Rebecca got our home address, but she had sent a package directly to Sarah. The package contained copies of my forged degree certificate alongside a letter from the university confirming that no such degree had ever been awarded. It contained printouts of old employment records showing the discrepancies in my story, and it contained a handwritten note from Rebecca explaining exactly who I really was and how long I had been lying. Sarah didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. It was like she was looking at a stranger, and in a way, she was. The man she had married, the man she had built a life with, the father of her children, did not exist. He had never existed. He was a character I had created to escape my own inadequacy, and now that character was being stripped away, layer by layer, leaving only the frightened, dishonest man underneath. She asked me one question, just one. She said, "Is any of it true?" I wanted to say yes. I wanted to tell her that my love for her was true, that our children were true, that everything that mattered was true. But I knew that wasn't what she was asking. She was asking about the foundation. She was asking about the stories I had told her when we first met. She was asking about my parents and my education and my past. And to those questions, the answer was no. Almost none of it was true. I told her everything that night. Not because I had finally found courage, but because there was nothing left to hide. The walls had fallen, the truth was exposed. All I could do was stand in the rubble and try to explain how I had become this person. I told her about Hartlepool, about my father who worked at the shipyard and my mother who cleaned houses, about the poverty and the shame and the desperate desire to be someone else. I told her about dropping out of university and forging my credentials. I told her about the lies I had told at every job interview, every networking event, every dinner party for the past 17 years. And then I told her the worst part. I told her about my mother. I told her that Patricia Harrison was not dead. I told her that my mother was alive and living alone in a small flat, wondering why her only son had abandoned her. I told her that I had lied about my parents' deaths because I was too ashamed to admit where I came from. I told her that our daughter's middle name, Elizabeth, was invented because I couldn't bring myself to use my mother's real name. Sarah broke then. She had been holding herself together through all of it, but the lie about my mother was too much. She started crying in a way I had never heard before. These weren't tears of sadness or even anger. They were tears of betrayal. She said she had mourned my parents with me. She had held me when I talked about missing them. She had felt sorry for me because I had no family to share our happiness with. And all that time, my mother had been alive, alone, abandoned by her own son. She asked me to leave that night. She said she couldn't look at me. She said she needed time to think, and she couldn't do that with me in the house. I packed a bag and went to stay with Marcus. When I told him what had happened, he didn't seem surprised. He said he had always known this day would come. He said he had been waiting for it, dreading it, for years. The next few weeks were the darkest of my life. My firm launched an internal investigation and quickly confirmed that my credentials were fraudulent. I was terminated immediately. There were discussions about potential legal action, but in the end, they decided that the publicity would be more damaging to them than to me. They wanted the whole thing to disappear quietly. I was allowed to resign rather than be fired. My name was removed from the company website. My office was cleared out. 17 years of work erased in an instant. The professional consequences were severe, but they were nothing compared to the personal ones. Sarah filed for separation within a month. She didn't want a divorce immediately, she said. She wanted time to figure out what she wanted, but she made it clear that she didn't know if she could ever trust me again. And without trust, she said, there was no marriage. I saw my children every other weekend. Emma, who was 9 by then, was old enough to sense that something terrible had happened. She asked me why I wasn't living at home anymore. She asked me if I had done something bad. I didn't know what to tell her. How do you explain to a child that their father is a liar? How do you help them understand that the person they looked up to is not who they thought he was? James was younger and more resilient. He was happy to see me whenever I came. He didn't seem to register the weight of what was happening. I was grateful for that, at least. I was grateful that I could hold my son without seeing disappointment in his eyes. The worst moment came about 6 weeks after Sarah found out. I was sitting in Marcus's spare bedroom, scrolling aimlessly through my phone, when I received an email from an address I didn't recognize. The sender's name was Patricia Harrison. My mother had found me. The email was short and formal, like she wasn't sure how to talk to her own son anymore. She said she had seen my name in a news article about corporate fraud, The story had been picked up by a few business publications, and although it was a minor scandal in the grand scheme of things, it was enough to generate some coverage. She said she had recognized my photo. She said she hadn't been sure it was really me until she read the details. She said she didn't understand why I had told people she was dead. She said she had spent years wondering what she had done wrong, why her only child had walked out of that funeral and never come back. She said she had written letters that came back returned to sender. She had called phone numbers that were disconnected. She had mourned me as if I were the one who had died, even though she knew I was alive somewhere, living a life that didn't include her. She said she wasn't angry anymore. She was too tired to be angry. She just wanted to know if I was okay. She said if I never wanted to speak to her again, she would accept that. But if I did want to talk, she would be there. She would always be there. I sat in that spare bedroom and I cried in a way I hadn't cried since I was a child. I cried for my mother alone in her flat, thinking her son was ashamed of her. I cried for my wife, who had given me everything and received deception in return. I cried for my children, who would grow up knowing their father was a fraud. And I cried for myself, for the terrified young man who had been so desperate to escape his circumstances that he had destroyed everything he touched. I wrote back to my mother that night. It was the hardest thing I had ever done, harder than lying to Sarah, harder than maintaining the fiction for all those years, because this time I had to tell the truth. I had to admit what I had done and why I had done it. I had to face the woman I had abandoned and try to explain the inexplicable. I told her everything about the lies and the forged documents, about Sarah and the children she didn't know she had, about the shame that had eaten away at me for so long that I had forgotten what it felt like to live without it. I told her I understood if she hated me. I told her I hated myself, but I said I was sorry. I said I was so sorry. She called me the next morning. I let it ring 3 times before I could bring myself to answer. When I heard her voice, thin and trembling but unmistakably hers, I felt something shift inside me. It was like a door opening after being locked for years. My mother, my actual living, breathing mother, speaking to me for the first time in nearly a decade. She didn't yell. She didn't lecture. She just said she was glad I was okay. She said she had been so worried. She said she had prayed for me every single day, even when she thought I was never coming back. We talked for 2 hours. I told her about Emma and James. She cried when she heard their names. She said she couldn't believe she was a grandmother. She asked if she would ever get to meet them, and I said I didn't know, but I hoped so. I said a lot of things were uncertain right now, but I said I wanted to try. I said I wanted to make things right, even if I had no idea how. Over the following months, my mother and I began rebuilding our relationship. It was slow and awkward at first. We were essentially strangers who happened to share blood, but gradually we found our way back to each other. I went to visit her in Hartlepool, the town I had spent so many years trying to escape. I walked through the streets where I had grown up, and for the first time, I didn't feel ashamed. I felt something closer to acceptance. This was where I came from. This was who I really was. And maybe that wasn't something to run away from. Sarah watched this process from a distance. We were still separated, but we talked regularly because of the children. She knew I was reconnecting with my mother. She knew I was trying to become a different person, or rather, trying to become the person I had pretended not to be all along. I don't know exactly when things started to shift between us. It wasn't a single moment. It was more like a gradual thawing. She started asking more questions about my mother. She asked what Patricia was like. She asked about my childhood, the real version this time. And unlike before, I told her the truth. I told her about the worn-out shoes and the secondhand toys. I told her about the shame and the desperation and the fear. I told her things I had never told anyone, things I had been running from my entire adult life. She listened without judgment. I don't know if she understood exactly. How could she? She had never been in my position. She had never felt the crushing weight of poverty and the terror of being trapped in a life she didn't choose. But she tried to understand, and that was more than I deserved. 8 months after Sarah found the letter, she invited my mother to visit London. I was terrified. This was the collision of two worlds I had worked so hard to keep separate. My mother, with her working class accent and her modest clothes. My wife, with her comfortable upbringing and her educated friends. I had convinced myself that these worlds could never coexist, that my mother would somehow contaminate the life I had built. But I was wrong. Patricia Harrison arrived at our house, the house I had bought with money earned through deception, and she looked around with wide eyes and said it was very nice. She hugged Emma and James with tears streaming down her face. She told them she was so happy to finally meet them. And Emma, my perceptive, wonderful daughter, hugged her back and said she was happy to meet her grandmother too. Sarah watched this reunion with an expression I couldn't read. Later, after my mother had gone back to her hotel, Sarah told me that she finally understood something. She said she had spent months being angry at me for lying about my family. She had felt like the lie was a rejection of her, like I didn't trust her enough to tell her the truth. But watching me with my mother, she realized that the lie was never about her. It was about me. It was about a scared kid who didn't know how to be proud of where he came from. She said she wasn't ready to forgive me yet. She said trust, once broken, takes a long time to rebuild. But she said she was willing to try. She said the man who sat in her kitchen that day, introducing his mother to his children, was not the same man who had lied to her 10 years ago. She said I had changed, and she wanted to see where that change might lead. It has been 3 years since that day. Sarah and I are still together. We renewed our vows last year in a small ceremony attended by both our families. My mother was there, sitting in the front row, crying tears of joy. Emma and James stood beside us as we promised to love each other in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, and this time I meant every word. I am not working in consulting anymore. After everything that happened, my reputation in that industry was destroyed, but I found a new path. I work now as a career counselor at a community college, helping students from backgrounds like mine navigate the professional world. I tell them the truth about how hard it is. I tell them about the obstacles they'll face and the temptation to cut corners. And I tell them what happens when you build your life on lies. I don't hide my past. I use it as a teaching tool. If my failures can help someone else avoid the same mistakes, then maybe some good can come from all the damage I caused. Rebecca Thornton got what she wanted in a way. She destroyed the version of me that had been living a lie. But she didn't destroy me. She didn't destroy my marriage or my family or my relationship with my mother. If anything, she did me a favor. She forced me to face the truth that I had been running from for most of my adult life. She forced me to become someone real. I think about her sometimes. I don't hate her. I don't even blame her, really. She saw an opportunity to hurt someone who she felt had hurt her, and she took it. I might have done the same thing in her position. The difference is that I understand now that revenge doesn't make you feel better. It just spreads the pain around. Rebecca got her moment of satisfaction, but I got my life back. I got my wife back. I got my mother back. I would say I came out ahead. The hardest part of this entire experience has been forgiving myself. Sarah has forgiven me. My mother has forgiven me. My children, who are now old enough to understand some of what happened, have accepted me as I am, but I still struggle with the man I used to be. I still have nightmares about those years of deception. I still wake up sometimes with the old panic rising in my chest, certain that any moment the truth will come out, before I remember that the truth already did come out and I survived it. My therapist, a kind woman I've been seeing for 2 years now, tells me that shame is a prison we build for ourselves. She says the only way out is to stop running and face what we're afraid of. I'm still learning how to do that. Some days are easier than others, but I'm trying. Every day, I'm trying. I told you at the beginning that I wanted you to understand how a person ends up in this situation. I hope I've done that. I hope you can see that I'm not a monster. I'm just a man who was afraid. Afraid of being poor, afraid of being judged, afraid of not being good enough. And that fear drove me to do terrible things. But here's what I've learned. The thing I wish I had understood 20 years ago when I was a young man looking at a forged degree certificate. The truth always comes out. Maybe not today, maybe not next year, maybe not for a decade, but eventually, every lie is exposed. Every secret is revealed. Every carefully constructed facade comes crashing down. And when it does, you have a choice. You can let the destruction bury you, or you can stand up, look at the rubble, and start building something new, something real, something true. I chose to build something true. Sarah asked me recently if I regret any of it, the lies, the deception, the years of hiding, and I thought about it for a long time before I answered. The honest answer is complicated. I regret the pain I caused. I regret the years I stole from my mother. I regret the trust I betrayed. But I also know that those experiences made me who I am today. They taught me lessons I couldn't have learned any other way. They forced me to confront parts of myself I had been avoiding my entire life. So no, I don't regret it. Not exactly. I regret the harm, but I accept the journey. Because that journey led me here. To this house in Richmond. To this woman who loves me despite everything. To these children who are growing up knowing that their father is flawed but trying. To this mother who never stopped praying for her son. My name is Daniel Harrison. For 10 years, I lied to my wife about who I was, and when she found the truth, I thought it would destroy everything. But it didn't destroy everything. It destroyed only the parts that needed to be destroyed, the lies, the pretense, the exhausting performance of being someone I was never meant to be. What remained after all the destruction was something I had been afraid of my entire life. What remained was me. The real me, the kid from Hartlepool with the worn-out shoes and the secondhand toys, the man who made terrible mistakes and somehow found his way back. And for the first time in my life, that is enough. I am enough. I never thought I would be the kind of man who looks at his own reflection and feels nothing but shame. But here I am, sitting in my study at 2 a.m, staring at a photograph of my wife on our wedding day, and I cannot remember the last time I told her something that was completely true. My name is Daniel Harrison, and for 10 years, I built our entire marriage on a foundation of lies. Not small lies. Not the kind of lies people tell to protect feelings or avoid arguments. I am talking about the kind of lies that destroy everything when they finally come to light. And they always come to light. I learned that the hard way. Sarah found out 3 months ago. The woman I promised to love and cherish, the woman who gave me 2 beautiful children, the woman who trusted me with her entire heart, discovered that the man she married never really existed. The Daniel Harrison she knew was a carefully constructed fiction, a character I had been playing for so long that I almost forgot where the act ended and I began. Almost, but not quite, because the guilt was always there, sitting in my chest like a stone I could never quite swallow. I want to tell you this story, not because I deserve your sympathy. I don't. Not because I want forgiveness. I'm not sure I've earned that either. I want to tell you because I need someone to understand how a person ends up in this situation. How a young man with good intentions becomes a liar. How that liar becomes a husband. How that husband spends a decade looking over his shoulder, waiting for everything to fall apart. And how, when it finally does, he realizes that the falling apart was actually the beginning of something else entirely. Let me take you back to where this all started. Not to the first lie I ever told Sarah. That came later. Let me take you back to the moment I decided to become someone I wasn't. Because that's where this story really begins. I grew up in Hartlepool, a small town in the northeast of England, where opportunities were as scarce as the sunshine. My father worked at the shipyard until it closed, and after that, he worked whatever jobs he could find. My mother cleaned houses for families who lived in neighborhoods we could only drive through. We were poor, and not in the romantic working class hero kind of way that looks good in films. We were poor in the way that meant I wore the same shoes until they fell apart. We were poor in the way that meant Christmas was often a secondhand toy and a forced smile. I don't tell you this to make you feel sorry for me. I tell you this because you need to understand what I was running from. By the time I was 16, I knew I wanted more. I wanted to be the kind of man who walked into a room and commanded respect. I wanted to wear suits that fit properly. I wanted to eat at restaurants where they didn't list the prices on the menu because the people who ate there didn't need to ask. I wanted everything my parents could never give me. I was smart. Teachers told me that constantly, not genius level smart, but sharp enough to get good marks without trying very hard. I applied to university and got accepted to study business at a decent institution in Manchester. It wasn't Oxford or Cambridge, but it was away from Hartlepool, and that was all that mattered to me. I packed a single suitcase, kissed my mother goodbye, and I promised myself I would never look back. For 2 years, I tried to be a legitimate success story. I attended lectures, I completed assignments, I worked part-time at a cafe to cover my expenses because the money my parents sent wasn't nearly enough. But somewhere in my second year, something inside me shifted. I started to realize that no matter how good my grades were, there were other students at that university who would always have an advantage over me. They had connections. They had family names that opened doors. They had the kind of confidence that comes from never having worried about money a single day in their lives. I remember the exact moment the first real lie was born. It was a Thursday afternoon, and I was sitting in a career fair listening to a recruiter from a major consulting firm talk about what they looked for in graduates. He used words like polish and network and the right kind of background. And I understood with perfect clarity that he was not talking about me. He was talking about the students who summered in France and whose fathers played golf with executives. I was invisible to him. I was never going to be what they were looking for. That night, I went back to my cramped dormitory room and I made a decision that would haunt me for the next 16 years. I decided that if the world wouldn't accept me as I was, I would simply become someone else. It started small. I began telling people that my father was a retired naval officer instead of an unemployed shipyard worker. I said my mother was a retired school teacher instead of a house cleaner who struggled with depression. These seemed like harmless adjustments at the time. I told myself everyone embellished a little. I told myself I was just leveling the playing field. But lies are like cracks in a foundation. They start small, and then they spread. By the time I was 23, I had dropped out of university during my third year. I never told anyone. I couldn't afford the tuition anymore, and I was too proud to ask for help. Instead of going home in shame, I moved to London with what little money I had saved and I began building a new identity. I found a job at a small marketing firm that didn't verify credentials as thoroughly as they should have. I told them I had graduated with honors. They believed me. For the next 2 years, I worked harder than anyone else in that office. I arrived earlier and stayed later. I learned everything I could about the industry. I networked at every event I could get into, and I kept lying about my degree, about my background, about my family. The lies became so natural that I almost forgot they were lies at all. That's when I met Marcus Chen. Marcus was different from everyone else I encountered in London. He was ambitious like me, but he was also genuine. He had come from a modest background himself, first-generation immigrant parents who ran a small restaurant in Birmingham. But unlike me, Marcus had done everything the right way. He had actually earned his degree. He had built his success on truth rather than deception. We became friends almost immediately. There was something about Marcus that made me want to be honest with him. Maybe it was because I saw echoes of my own struggle in his story. Maybe it was because I was desperately lonely and tired of pretending all the time. Whatever the reason, one night after too many drinks at a bar near our office, I told Marcus the truth about my education. I remember the way he looked at me, not with judgment like I had expected, not with disgust. He looked at me with something that might have been pity, but also with something that might have been understanding. He said he wouldn't tell anyone. He said he understood why I had done it. He said the system was rigged against people like us and that sometimes you had to play the game by your own rules. I should have taken that moment as a warning. I should have seen that if I could confess to Marcus, then the truth was closer to the surface than I wanted to admit. But instead, I took his acceptance as validation. I told myself that what I was doing wasn't really wrong. I was just a working class kid trying to survive in a world that was designed to keep people like me out. 3 years after moving to London, I was working at a prestigious consulting firm. I had lied my way through the interview process with forged documents and a carefully rehearsed story about my academic achievements. The firm was exactly the kind of place I had dreamed about as a teenager in Hartlepool. Glass offices, designer suits, clients who ran corporations worth billions. I had made it, or at least I had convinced everyone that I had made it. That was the year I met Sarah Mitchell. She was 26 years old, a primary school teacher with warm brown eyes and a laugh that made me feel like I was standing in sunshine. I met her at a charity event that my firm was sponsoring. She was there with a friend, looking slightly uncomfortable in a dress that she later told me she had borrowed because she couldn't afford to buy something fancy. I loved her from the moment I saw her. I know that sounds like something people say in films, but it's true. There was something about Sarah that cut through all my defenses. We talked for 3 hours that night. She told me about her students, about the little boy who had finally learned to read that week, about the girl who had overcome her shyness to perform in the school play. She talked about her family with such warmth and affection that I felt a physical ache in my chest. Her parents were still married after 35 years. Her younger sister was her best friend. They had Sunday dinners together and called each other every day just to check in, and then she asked about my family. That was the moment I should have told her the truth. I was already falling in love with this woman. I could feel it happening, like stepping off a ledge into open air. I should have told her that my father had died of a heart attack 2 years earlier, and that I hadn't even gone to the funeral because I was too ashamed of who I had become. I should have told her that my mother was still alive, still cleaning houses in Hartlepool, still waiting for me to call. I should have told her that I had cut off everyone from my past because I couldn't bear for them to see the lies I was living. Instead, I told her that my parents had both passed away. I told her that I was an only child and that I had no family left. I watched her face fill with compassion and sympathy. She reached across the table and took my hand. She said she was so sorry. She said she couldn't imagine how lonely that must have been. And I sat there, holding the hand of the woman I would marry, and I let her comfort me for a loss that had never happened. That was the lie that changed everything. Not the lie about my education, although that was serious enough. The lie about my family. Because once I told Sarah that my parents were dead, there was no going back. I couldn't suddenly resurrect them. I couldn't admit, 6 months or a year or 5 years later, that actually my mother was alive and well and wondering why her only son had abandoned her. That lie locked me into a prison of my own making. Sarah and I fell in love quickly. She was everything I had never allowed myself to want. She was kind and patient and honest. She believed in goodness in a way that I had stopped believing years ago. She looked at me like I was a good man, and when she looked at me that way, I almost believed it myself. I proposed after 2 years of dating. I took her to Paris because I had the money to do things like that by then. I got down on one knee in front of the Eiffel Tower while tourists watched and took photos. She cried. She said yes. She threw her arms around me and said I was the best thing that had ever happened to her. I should have felt happy, and part of me was happy, but there was another part of me, a part that was growing larger by the day, that felt like I was watching a stranger live someone else's life. How could she love me when she didn't even know who I really was? How could this marriage be real when it was built on a foundation of falsehoods? I pushed those thoughts down. I became very good at pushing things down. We got married the following summer in a small church near her parents' home in Surrey. Her entire family was there, her aunts and uncles, her cousins, her childhood friends, everyone who had ever mattered to her. On my side, there was Marcus and a handful of colleagues from work. Sarah asked me once if I wished I had family there. I told her it made me sad, but that I had come to terms with being alone long ago. She held my face in her hands and promised that I would never be alone again. The guilt I felt in that moment was physical. It was a weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. But I smiled. I said my vows. I kissed my bride, and I began a marriage that was, from its very first moment, a lie. The first year of our marriage was the hardest. Not because we fought. We rarely fought. Sarah was so easy to love and so easy to be with that our daily life was genuinely happy. The hardest part was managing the deception. Sarah wanted to know everything about my past. She would ask questions about my childhood, about my parents, about what Christmas was like growing up, and I had to invent answers on the spot while being careful to remember every detail so I wouldn't contradict myself later. I created a fictional version of my parents based loosely on people I had seen in films. My fictional father was a stern but loving man who worked in banking and taught me the value of hard work. My fictional mother was a gentle woman who made Sunday roasts and helped me with my homework. They had died in a car accident when I was 22. It was sudden and tragic, and I preferred not to talk about it in detail. Sarah accepted all of this. Why wouldn't she? She had no reason to doubt me. I was her husband. I was the man she had chosen to spend her life with. The idea that I could be lying about something so fundamental probably never crossed her mind, but the lies kept growing. When Sarah became pregnant with our first child, she asked if we could name the baby after my mother if it was a girl. I had never told her my mother's name because I had been avoiding specific details. I panicked for a moment, then said my mother had been called Elizabeth. It wasn't her real name. Her real name was Patricia, but Elizabeth sounded more refined, more appropriate for the fictional family I had created. We had a daughter. We named her Emma, which Sarah chose in the end, but she said we would save Elizabeth for a middle name or for a future daughter. Every time I heard my child called Emma Elizabeth Harrison, I thought about my real mother, Patricia, sitting alone in her small flat in Hartlepool, not knowing she was a grandmother. I had not spoken to my mother in almost 8 years by then. The last time I had seen her was at my father's funeral, which I had attended only because Marcus had convinced me that I would regret it if I didn't. I had slipped into the back of the church, watched the service from a distance, and left before anyone could speak to me. My mother had seen me. I know she had. She had looked right at me across the rows of mourners, and her face had crumpled with hope and confusion. But I had turned away. I had walked out of that church and back to my life in London, and I had never looked back. I told myself I was protecting her. If she knew the man I had become, the lies I was living, it would only hurt her more. But the truth was simpler and uglier than that. I was protecting myself. I couldn't bear for my mother to see me. I couldn't bear for her to meet Sarah and the fictional life I had built. I couldn't bear the questions and the explanations and the inevitable unraveling. So I erased her. I made her a ghost. And every year on her birthday, and every year on Mother's Day, and every year at Christmas, I thought about her alone in that flat, and I hated myself a little more. Our son James was born 3 years after Emma. By then, I was a senior partner at the firm. I was earning more money than I had ever imagined possible. We had bought a beautiful house in Richmond, near the park, with a garden where the children could play. Sarah had taken time off from teaching to be with the kids. and she was the kind of mother I had always wished I had. Patient, present, endlessly loving. From the outside, we were the perfect family, but inside, I was crumbling. The problem with lying is that it requires constant maintenance. You have to remember what you said to whom. You have to anticipate questions and prepare answers. You have to live in a state of permanent vigilance, always watching for the moment when someone might catch you in a contradiction. It is exhausting. It is like being an actor who is never allowed to leave the stage. Marcus was the only person who knew even part of the truth, and even he didn't know everything. He didn't know about my mother. He didn't know about the other lies I had told Sarah. He only knew about my forged credentials, and he had kept that secret for years without ever threatening to expose me. But even with Marcus, I could never fully relax. Even with him, there was always a part of me that was performing. The closest I came to confessing to Sarah was the night of our 5th wedding anniversary. We had left the kids with her parents and gone to a hotel in the Cotswolds for a weekend away. After dinner, we were sitting by a fire in our room, and Sarah was talking about how lucky she felt to have found me. She said I was the most honest person she knew. She said that in a world full of people who pretended to be something they weren't, I was always exactly who I appeared to be. She said that was one of the things she loved most about me. I nearly told her then. The words were right there, pushing against my lips, desperate to escape. I wanted to tell her everything. I wanted to fall to my knees and beg for forgiveness. I wanted to be free of the weight that was slowly crushing me. But I looked at her face in the firelight. I looked at the trust in her eyes, and I couldn't do it. I couldn't bear to watch that trust turn to horror and then to hatred. I couldn't bear to lose her. So I swallowed the words. I kissed her forehead. I told her I loved her more than anything, and I added another layer to the prison I was building around myself. The years passed. Emma started school. James took his first steps. Sarah went back to teaching part-time once the kids were older. I was promoted again and again, rising through the ranks of the firm until I was one of the most senior partners. No one ever questioned my credentials. No one ever looked too closely at the story I had told. The lie had become so established, so embedded in the fabric of my life, that it almost seemed true. But the guilt never faded. If anything, it grew stronger with each passing year. I started having nightmares about being exposed. I would wake up in a cold sweat, heart pounding, certain that today was the day everything would fall apart. Sarah would ask me what was wrong, and I would say it was just work stress. Another lie on top of all the others. I started drinking more than I should. Not to the point of obvious intoxication, but enough that I needed a few glasses of whiskey every night just to quiet the voice in my head. I started avoiding social situations where I might be asked questions about my past. I became more withdrawn, more guarded, more difficult to reach. Sarah noticed. Of course she noticed. She was perceptive in a way that terrified me. She would ask if something was wrong, if I was unhappy, if there was something I needed to tell her. And every time I would reassure her that everything was fine. I would say I was just tired. I would say the pressure at work was getting to me. I would say anything except the truth. Our marriage started to suffer, not dramatically, not in ways that other people would notice, but in small ways that accumulated over time. We talked less, we laughed less. The easy intimacy we had shared in the early years became strained. Sarah felt like I was pulling away from her, and she was right. I was. I was so consumed by my own lies that I had nothing left to give her. I knew I was losing her. I could feel the distance growing between us, and I knew it was my own fault, but I couldn't find a way to stop it. The lies were too big. The consequences were too severe. I had trapped myself in a situation where every path forward led to destruction. If I told the truth, I would lose everything. If I kept lying, I would slowly suffocate. There was no good option, there was only survival, and then Rebecca Thornton came back into my life. I had known Rebecca years earlier, when we both worked at the same marketing firm in my early London days. She had been ambitious and smart and ruthless in a way that I had admired at the time. We had been friendly, though never close. I left that firm long before she did, and I hadn't thought about her in years. But she had thought about me. I ran into her at a conference in Manchester. I was speaking on a panel about leadership in the consulting industry. Afterwards, during the networking reception, I felt a tap on my shoulder and turned around to see Rebecca standing there with a glass of wine and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. We exchanged pleasantries. She told me she had followed my career with interest. She said she was impressed by how far I had come. And then, just as I was about to excuse myself, she leaned in close and said something that made my blood run cold. She said she had always wondered how I had managed to get into that consulting firm without a degree. She said she remembered when I joined the marketing company how there had been whispers about whether my credentials were legitimate. She said she had done some digging over the years, just out of curiosity, and she had found some very interesting things. I don't remember exactly what I said in response. I know I tried to laugh it off. I know I said something about how there were always rumors about successful people, but my heart was pounding so hard that I was certain she could hear it. This woman knew, or at least she suspected, and the look in her eyes told me that she had no intention of letting it go.